I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Claire Jiménez. Oh, some of you may know her debut story collection. It was a while ago called Staten Island Stories, but What Happened to Ruthy Ramirez? Everyone needs to read this book. It's wait until you meet Nina and Jessica and Dolores. They are just going to, it's so great. Claire, it's so good to see you, but can I ask you to introduce yourself and the novel just because it's fun?
Yeah, it's so wonderful to be here, and thank you again for inviting me. Yeah, so my name is Claire Jiménez. I'm originally from New York, but right now I just moved to South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina. I'm an assistant professor of English and African American Studies at the over there. So yeah, and I'm a writer, and I just got my novel coming out, so very excited.
Okay, but let's talk about these women. We do open with a rough spot. I mean, their sister has gone missing, and we're 10 years after that event. But Nina and Jessica and Mama Dolores, where did these women come from? Where did Ruthy come from? How did this novel start?
Definitely, I was thinking a lot about, missing Black and brown girls and women and indigenous girls and women, and how there's less play and there's less attention to those stories when they happen. That was definitely inside of my mind when I was writing. And I was also thinking a lot about reality TV. I was thinking of that time, at the beginning of the millennium when reality TV was just everywhere and everybody was watching it. And it was addictive, but it was violent and problematic, right? And then thinking about how often the bodies of Black and brown women become sites of violence on shows for entertainment. That combined with working retail and just thinking about Puerto Rican women and Puerto Rican voices, those all came together as I was writing the novel.
You are very funny. Your women are very funny. You set up a lot of very funny, let's call them set pieces, right? Because there are moments in the story, you're moving the story forward, that Dolores spends a lot of time talking to God and she has opinions and she is awesome. But you're also talking about colonialism.
Yeah.
You're also talking about poverty. You're talking about really big, sometimes hard ideas, but the way you sort of pass it off to us in this novel is such a delight because of these women. And I have to come back to it. So who showed up first? Which of these voices showed up first?
Oh man, that prologue I think was actually the first thing that came. I remember writing it in Nashville. I was in the MFA program there at Vanderbilt, and I remember actually it was at this, I think it was Cafe Coco or something like this. I lived very close to it. That was back when you can like live in Nashville close to Vanderbilt. Now it's like, $1 million houses everywhere. But this was 10 years ago, and it was it was that voice that came to the surface, thinking about disappearance, thinking about loss. Nina's kind of, quick wit and summary, but also grief. And so once I had that voice, I'm a writer who thinks first about voice.
Yeah.
And then who listens to the way people talk. And, sometimes I have a document that has random words and quotes, that things that I think about or things I might overhear on the bus. And I may never see that person again in my life, but it might trigger something inside of me. And so once I nailed down that voice, the rest of the story came together. But it first started as a short story. It didn't become a novel till many years later.
Okay, I heard it started as a short story called Catfight. And Catfight is the name of the show itself.
That's
contained. Right. So instead of a book about a book, you've written a book about a TV show to a certain extent. But here's the thing. So Sister Ruthy, it's Jessica, then Ruthy, then Nina, right?
Yeah.
Ruthy's the middle child. She has disappeared at the end of the 90s, and we meet everyone as adults. And it's been made very clear that no one knows what's happened to Ruthy. The police are not particularly interested in helping the family find out what's happening. And Dad has died. And so it's really, at this point, it's Jessica, it's Nina, it's Dolores.
Yeah.
But you give everyone sort of, let's call it a turn at the microphone, right? Like everyone gets to narrate their own chapters. Nina sort of lays everything out for us. Jessica's a working mom. She's got a toddler. She's got a partner who loves her. It sounds like they've known each other since junior high, right? Okay, so we're in this really tight community. And
Yeah.
Dolores knows everyone else's children.
Yeah, that's right.
Everyone knows. So you kind of can't keep your business to yourself.
Yeah.
And Dolores was also very young when she got married and had her first child.
That's right.
So how do you set this up? I mean, you know this world. You started with the story. This is not autofiction. I mean, there's a little bit of overlap. There's some details. I mean, Nina is going to work at the start of the Great Recession, so she ends up with her fancy college degree.
That's right.
Selling underpants.
Yeah.
At the mall.
Yeah.
She's not happy about it.
Yeah.
But you have so many threads working through. I mean, there's class consciousness. There are the sisters being in different places, emotionally, intellectually. Where did you start? I mean, yes, you just told us you started with the voice in the prologue, but that's not all you can do.
Originally, with the short story, it was Nina's voice. And then I had trouble really placing the story and thinking about it. And then only in years later, I had already graduated from Vanderbilt with the MFA. I was adjuncting. I was working many jobs. And I kind of tapped out and I said, you know what? I'm going to go back and get my PhD. And then I went to Nebraska, of all places. And I remember I brought this story in, and Janice Agee, she was one of the professors there.
Yep.
And she's like, you know, Claire, I think that the problem with this story is that it's not a story, it's a novel. And she's like, I need you to give me 80 pages, in a few weeks. And which kind of terrified me, because I was like, oh, what will this look like? And the only way I could really envision telling this story was through multiple voices, right? And thinking about, this is a story about a family. This is a story that's not just one person's voice. It's sort of a chorus of women, right? Who are building and adding upon the narrative. And I wanted to build upon the tension of what is known, what each character knows, and what they don't know, right? And how does that vibrate against each other as the novel progresses?
Did you surprise yourself at all while you were writing what happened to Ruthy Ramirez?
I did. Yes, I did.
Can we have an example that's not a spoiler?
Oh, man. Well, yes. I think that I surprised myself with the mother. I think I was worried about, writing the mother's perspective, because at that time I wasn't a mother. Only recently I became a mother, And so now, and then I understood a little bit of what was happening there. And I think I surprised myself when I realized that so much of that I could frame her sections as sort of this one-sided prayer, right?
Yeah,
and
completely.
I thought to myself, what would that mother's voice sound like? And it would be after missing a daughter. And for me, knowing that this character, it would be that you're constantly praying, you're constantly hoping, you're constantly thinking about your daughter. And that's how that section kind of unraveled. I also surprised myself with Irene, who is like,
oh, her friend. Dolores's friend, Irene.
Yeah, Dolores' comadre, right? Like, I wanted a trickster character, and I was like, okay, Irene is the perfect trickster. Like, I'm gonna have her come in and be like comedic relief, but also be like, really be a comadre to Dolores. Like, okay, she's there to help her through these moments.
The other thing I appreciate about Dolores too, and when she's talking to God, it's very funny. I mean, it is very, very funny, but she's also really angry.
Yeah.
She's angry at what she's seeing happen to other women, not just her daughters, but she teaches a parenting class at a church, and she's like, you sent us a priest who's like 20. How is he going to manage us? He has no idea what he's doing.
Yeah.
And, women don't often get to express their rage. It makes other people very uncomfortable.
That's right.
And Jakira Diaz actually said, Ordinary Girls, the author of Ordinary Girls, she actually has a very cool line about how your characters reject respectability. And I love that.
Me too.
Can we just noodle around with that idea for a second? Because I think that's really important, that these women are kind of like, you can judge me however you want, but you're wrong. And they will go to the mat for each other, these girls. They are they're great. But they don't owe anyone an explanation. And that just feels so refreshing to read in fiction right now.
Yeah, I love Hakira for saying that. I mean, because I feel like as another Puerto Rican woman, I feel like she really got and understood the novel. And, there's, for Dolores' section in particular, I wanted it to be a prayer, but I also wanted it to be a profane prayer. I wanted it to have that anger. that's honest, right? And the way these women grieve might not be the way somebody else grieves, but that is just as legitimate. It makes me cringe when I hear people say, like, oh, this feels too profane, or I don't like the way these women talk, or they should talk a certain type of way, because what that says to me is like, you care more about profanity than femicide, right? Or you're asking somebody to talk in a polite way about something that has ripped their life in half, right? And respectability politics are often a tool of white supremacy, right? It says, tell me your story, but in a way that won't offend me. And that to me is so troubling, right? And so this book is absolutely against that, and so, and I'm unapologetically, and I as an author am unapologetic about it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I would never ask you to. I think what you do is so smart, though, but by making these women so engaging and so funny and so smart, I was just pulled through. And also, I mean, it moves. You do not, there is no slowing down of the brakes anywhere, which I really love, because I needed to know. And that's kind of all I'm going to say, because I do not want to spoil this book for other people. It is so good, this book. It is
Thank you so much.
So good. And I know you and I were talking about this before I hit the record button. We have to talk about Puerto Rico, because I feel like there are a lot of folks out in the world who don't understand that Puerto Rico is part of the United States. It is not, in fact, a separate entity. And that really does inform your women, too. I mean, Nina and Jessica, Nina doesn't speak Spanish. Just doesn't speak Spanish. She's a New Yorker. She's a New York kid. But at the same time, there is some internalized colonialism happening that she and Jessica are kind of butting heads over, and a little bit with mom, but mostly it's the sisters. So let's bring people into that part of the conversation.
Well, yeah, and I think the first thing is, like, a lot of people don't understand the colonial relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico, the way in which the United States has not treated Puerto Rico well for, since they acquired it, right? And they don't understand that because of the nature of citizenship, that there's often a circular migration, or that migration is violent, or that there are people in Puerto Rico who want independence, right? Like, what that history of that migration, how that might shape the lives of people in the diaspora. So for this family, Dolores is very much shaped by that, right? And so the question that I kept on coming to while I was writing the novel was, how do these daughters inherit that, right? Even though they're not first generation immigrants coming to, or migrants, right, would be the more appropriate word, but there are ways in which that experience overlaps a little bit. Coming to New York, in what ways do they inherit that, right? And how does that play out inside their lives? So I was really interested in exploring that. For Nina, right, there's a loss of language that brings a lot of shame. And what does that mean? How does that affect the way she, talks to Jessica? What are the resentments, right? Or the way in which she feels. Nina's a person who doesn't really feel like she belongs anywhere, right? She doesn't fit in with the cool girls in her middle school when she's trying to dance, and she's not a person who fit in at the predominantly white college she went to, right? And then she also feels like sort of like an outlier in her family. And so I really wanted to play around with that.
I sort of feel like Jessica's happier and more settled than Nina in a lot of ways, even though things are not the easiest for her. But I do feel like she's got a little bit of a better handle on things. But let's give listeners an example of what Jessica's own internalized colonialism looks like, because she's doing it too. I
feel like with Jessica, she wants a better life, she wants, to be better paid. She wants these things, whether she knows how to get them, that's something that she's definitely struggling with. I think she, early on in the novel, she struggles with the whiteness of Lou's family. And I think this comes up inside of the novel. She's also unapologetically Puerto Rican, but she's also very light-skinned, right? And so this comes up inside of their conversations too, right? But she also speaks great Spanish, so there's these ways. I wanted to make characters that were complicated, and characters that were complicated linguistically, racially. Jessica is light-skinned, but her mother is not, right? Nina is not, So I wanted to represent the diversity inside of that family.
Yeah, no, I really appreciated that because, I mean, the thing is, too, we love reading stories about sisters because they're complicated. And we do get to meet Ruth. Yes, Ruthie has disappeared, but we do get to meet her sort of in the days and weeks leading up to her disappearance. And she is very much her own person and very much not like her sisters at all. I mean, she's a
Yeah.
great character. She's a fantastic character. She's also very 13. She
Yeah.
is like all of the big emotions and all of the things and all of the feeling and da, da, da. And it's just like the energy that Ruthie brings to the page, even when
Yeah.
she's not
Yeah.
is wild. It's so great. Can we talk about structure for a second? I know you said earlier in the show that, you know, obviously you knew you needed multiple voices to tell this story. You still keep it very tight. I mean, this is under 300 pages. I mean, this is a very tightly told novel. So what did you have to get rid of? Because you and I both know that first drafts are not that clean.
Oh my God. Oh my God. I wrote hundreds of drafts, hundreds. Like, that feels like it's an exaggeration, but it's not. You know, like at first I wrote the story backwards. You know, at first the novel looked like a lot of short stories, right? And so every time I changed the structure, I had to cut something off, you know? And so like things didn't fit or it felt superfluous, you know? And I think at one point I decided like, okay, so I'm just going to tell it straight. I'm going to do a typical kind of journey narrative because everything else is so complicated, right? Having a multi-voiced novel, being able to make each of those voices distinct, being able to switch throughout, you know, switch perspectives, you know, and have a Ruthie perspective as well. Like I was like, okay, so maybe I should try to find in terms of plot to shoot straight with it, even though a lot of in ways I think I subvert that at times, you know, like I make little turns, but
you definitely do that within each section. And I think there are a couple of moments where you play with time in a really interesting way, but they also feel dangerously spoilery. They feel very, very spoilery.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that everyone's always in a very contained space. So you're in a room in a church basement, you're in a specific place in school, you're in the, you know, one of the apartments. There's almost a language that goes with each place. And Dolores kind of says this in a couple of different ways, where she's like, well, there's the face you show here and the face you show there and the face. And yet I feel for these women, you know, this code switching that they have to do. And it's just like, oh, you can't catch a break.
Yeah, I think that's really apparent with Nina, you know, especially during the sections where she's at college, where she really navigates and has this awareness about like what she looks like to white people, right?
Yeah.
And then she plays around with it a little bit, right? But I wanted to think about place for Nina, for example, you know, there's the retail store, right? The Mariposas, that lingerie store. For Jessica, there's the hospital. For the mother, it's the church, right? And like to bring those places alive, you know? Of course, there's the island, right? Staten Island is like the stepchild of New York. I wanted
It is.
to bring it in there too, to sneak it in, that Staten Island Mall, the ferry, the water, you know.
Yep.
So,
And we have a store in Staten Island, and I've been there I've been to
oh
both the new
yes.
store and the old store. So I know at least that piece of it. But yeah, Staten Island really, like, there are times where you kind of look at it and go, right, that is one of the boroughs. It's not, no disrespect to Staten Island. It's just, if you live on Staten Island, you know what I'm talking about. And I think too, like the southern tip, people forget that it's very suburban and not at all, like there are parts of Staten Island that feel a little like New Jersey.
Oh yeah. Yeah, South Staten Island, South Shore, yeah.
It is kind of its own place. And, you know, Dolores certainly ends up there by marriage. I don't think it was ever in her plan to have her children. Like Nina was not planning on coming back. Jessica's kind of like, I have a nice life. I'm going to do my thing. This is home.
Yeah, I think Staten Island, I mean, there is this trajectory of folks moving from Brooklyn to Staten Island when things got kind of overpriced, right? Yeah. So Staten Island used to be much cheaper. Now I look at the prices on Staten Island, I'm like, woof, what, they're charging $1 million for a townhouse? Why? You know, but I think back in the 90s, it was definitely much more affordable, you know. Brooklyn was much more affordable back then too, but you could probably get more. And so it's a family that, you know, is looking for the nice house, you know, is looking for something that resembles, you know, like the American dream, right? Which of course collapses when we think when Ruthy disappears. Which, I mean, this is why also when I fast forwarded it to when they think they see her on a
On the
reality
reality show.
yeah, I I really wanted to put it in 2008 because I wanted to talk about the economic crisis there. I wanted to talk about all of the ways in which this idea of the American dream was really, it felt fragile, right?
I think it's still fragile for a lot
Oh,
of
of
people. I
course.
mean,
Yeah.
you have a PhD. I didn't know you went to college in Maine. Like, you did your undergrad in Maine. Like, you really can't find that many points that are further from Staten Island on the East Coast. Like, physically, I think technically it's further than, like, it's just, and
It's
I
like
say this as a
next to
person who went to
Canada.
college in Maine too.
Where did you go?
Yeah, I went to Bowdoin.
Oh, you voted. All right.
Yeah,
So we're
so
like,
like down the road from you,
like,
basically.
yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, you go to college in Maine. You then go to Nashville for your master's in fine arts. You get your MFA in creative writing in Nashville. And then you end up in Lincoln, Nebraska for a PhD. And now you're living in South Carolina. And part of me is wondering if you needed to leave Staten Island to be able to write about it.
That's a really good question, because actually when I went to Nashville, I got into this program never thinking I would get in, and then it happened. And then they paid for everything, you stay, like even during recruitment, I remember they paid for the whole time. Like, oh my God, this is so different than the life I'm currently living. But I say all of that because having that time was really important to me as a writer, because I was able to get writing done. And I also say that because being inside of Nashville, I realized that I was constantly writing about New York. When you're inside of the water, you don't think I'm swimming in water, right? Like, and so I think that people were like, listen, you're always writing about women, you're always writing about Staten Island. And for me, when I was writing my stories about Staten Island, I wasn't thinking I'm writing about Staten Island because that's where I lived. And I think that that's the beauty of having a program like that, because it helps you understand what are the themes and obsessions, what are the places you keep on going back to.
Mm-hmm.
No matter where I live, I always go back to those places. I haven't really written about living in the South, right? Even though I live in the South right now. I haven't really written about living in the Midwest. And I think sometimes that's because I'm not that far away from it yet. Whereas New York, I was born and grew up there. And so that's where I keep on returning.
I mean, one of the beautiful things about New York is you kind of do have to leave every now and again to remember why you're there all the time.
Yeah.
It's a great place to come back to. And I love living here and I love being here, but sometimes you have to just remember that there are places that aren't here because we're such a weird little microcosm of, some pretty great things and then some things where you're like, oh, yeah, we could do that better. We could really do that better. Like, why are we doing it that way? That just seems like a bad idea.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about literary influences for a second, though, because you've always been a reader. I'm pretty sure you're one of those folks who's also always wanted to be a writer, whether you knew it or not. Like, stories were always that thing. So let's dig in there for a second. And not just the people you studied in school and not just the people you studied with, because, I mean, that's a delight and that's great. But I think it goes deeper than that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've always loved writing. I've always loved reading. I mean, books have always been a part of my life, and storytelling as well. I really love authors like James Baldwin. I was telling somebody else in another interview there, I was like, I'm a very different writer than James Baldwin, because I always wanted to write like James Baldwin because he has that wonderful, expansive, like preacher voice, the beautiful control over sentences and clause upon clause. But even though stylistically I'm different, I'm still inspired by him every day. Like, I remember rereading Another Country over and over again and just thinking about, like, wow, how did he do this?
That opening where Rufus is walking through Times Square and you're just like, hi. And because, I mean, also, that book, wait, am I right? It's set in the 70s. So Times Square was kind of gross.
Yeah. So he's doing so much there. For me, it's because it's also like dealing with lots of different characters. He's like dipping into different points of view. For me, I feel like really the question that book is posing is like, given all of the violence, given all of the terrible things that our country has done, how can we ever love each other, right? And that is, he was just brilliant, But he's another one who was doing lots of point of views. I think about that. I've always loved books that are about characters voices, that are really getting into the head heads of people, books with a lot of scene, right? I love Grace Paley. I love writers like, Pedro Pietri, who these are the poets, the Puerto Rican poets of that age. Tony K. Bambara, writers who are really thinking about voice. Those are some big influences. There's so many more. I just, when I get stuck, I go back to the books I love. And, Sigrid Nunez, I think is wonderful.
Oh,
She doesn't have the
completely.
tilde over the end, so I think it's Nunez. But I just think she has an excellent command of sentences.
No, that's one of the things I really appreciate as I was reading What Happened to Ruthy Ramirez is you clearly are thinking about all of the different pieces. You're using characters to move the story forward. You're using characters to play with time. You're using character to play with perspective. And we get this sort of really dynamic 360 in a really tight story. Like, I can't stress this enough. You were just like, I don't need 600 pages. I'm just doing this how I'm doing it. And I feel like I know these women really, really well. And I feel like everyone's going to be okay. I do, like, I don't feel like I'm spoiling anything by saying like, they'll get there. They may not be there right this minute.
Thank you for saying that. Like, it is so nice for somebody to notice craft. Like a lot of times people look at Write as a Color, they're like, oh, they only talk about like what the book is about as opposed to how the book is built. And it's so nice to feel seen and be seen.
Yeah, no. Craft is important. Craft is really, really important. I mean, for me, I know you said at the top of the show that you read for voice first, and I read for voice first too. I mean, there's some people who just want to be told a story, and there's some people who have to like the characters. So I'm like, yeah, that's not me. I don't have to like the characters, but I need to care. I need to be invested. I need to have skin in the game. If I'm sort of shrugging my shoulders at the characters, good or bad, then there's no there for me. But language matters. I think language gets thrown out occasionally. Now, granted, also, like, was I taught to, diagram sentences as a small? Yes, I was. Okay, I went to one of those schools. And it's a really useful thing to know how to do. I do have feelings about grammar that you and I can save for another conversation, but I think,
I hope we have a conversation.
yeah, you and I would both be, but at the same time, it would be 8 hours long, and there would be a lot of, oh yeah, absolutely. I think grammar can be used in ways that, are not good for the wider conversations we need to have about class and privilege and other things. And to know that these women can navigate their world, right? Mm-hmm. And just be who they are and be like, yeah, you can tell me what you think you're telling me. And no. And I love that it's happening at all of their different ages. I mean, Dolores, so much. I'm guessing Irene is, Dolores, roughly Dolores's age or maybe a little older. And she's just like, oh, you girls. I mean, there's a moment where Irene and Dolores get into a club.
Yes.
And they leave the girls outside, and the girls are like, hey, wait, we're with them. And they're yelling the names, and Irene just turns around and goes, no, we don't know them.
Yeah, that was so fun to play. To write. It was so like, I've been thinking a lot. I've been talking to my students. I teach in the MFA program over here. And I've been talking to them a lot about play, right? Like, and how sometimes when we're in workshop, we forget to have joy while we write. And that was much fun to write. And it reminded me, it was like, this is why you started writing, right? And I've been thinking about incorporating that more into my practice.
It's so important. It's so, so important. And the other thing is too, like, you're not telling just one piece of this story. Yes, Ruthy disappears. It has a huge impact on her family, but Ruthy's disappearance is one piece of this family's life, and it's a very extreme piece. Did you ever read Miss Metropolitan by Carolyn Farrell?
I haven't, but that's been on my to be read list forever. So
right, okay.
It just came out. It came out last year or the year before.
In hardcover, I think it's a couple years old. The paperback's out, but what she does with voice, right? Because it's a harrowing story. I mean, these girls get kidnapped by a creep. He keeps them in the house. It's very, very loosely based on that guy in Ohio. And when I say loosely based, it's just the structure of house, girls held captive, very bad guy. But there are Greek choruses throughout. So there's a Greek chorus of neighborhood ladies, and the girls themselves are a singular voice. And what Carolyn does with voice in this book, that's wild. But there are moments too where there's genuine laughter, there's genuine joy, because otherwise we'd all just be holding our heads in our hands going, I don't know if I can keep doing it. But the way she structures this very intense
Yeah.
story about missing Black and brown girls, to use voice in this way and to have this chorus of women who are probably, roughly Dolores's and Irene's age, right? The ladies of the
Mhm.
neighborhood. It's so smart. It's
Oh, I can't wait to read it.
so smart. And it's just, and I feel that way about what you're doing with what happened to Ruthy Ramirez, because there are ways that you could have presented the story and still covered what you needed to cover, but it's the humor, it's the joy, it's the moments where someone does something and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
that's amazing. Because we need space to breathe. I mean, that's the thing. Like, we need space to breathe. We still need to have the conversations
Yeah.
about colonialism and respectability and all of these terrible legacy things and grammar.
Grammar.
Like, we have to, it really annoys me. It
You know,
really
I
annoys me.
understand.
Like, language should be constantly
Yeah.
evolving, right? And we see it with, disruptors. Like, Uber has become synonymous with not calling a taxi and calling a car, whatever.
Exactly.
But, we do it for other things. And I'm like, yeah, but we don't often extend that grace to people who are doing different things with language because we somehow have decided that, they're
Yeah.
not smart. I don't
Yeah.
like, I mean, if you think of like the entire history of rap music, I'm like,
Yeah.
how to manipulate language. And
Yeah. Brilliant poets or lyricists, are rappers. It's so unfortunate how limited people are sometimes when they think about literature or when they think about art. Like you said, I think grammar is something that constantly evolves, and it's a tool that we use to benefit us,
yeah,
not something
completely.
that we bow down to.
And anyway, like I said, that's an 8-hour conversation for you and I to have in another moment.
Yeah.
Do you miss these women? Do you miss this world?
I think it was a really hard book to write at times. And so there were moments of play, but it was also a very painful book to write. And so, there's a part of me that's even in thinking about the book and sometimes talking about the book, it can be a little bit hard for me. I guess this goes back to something that you were saying about humor, but I really do think for Puerto Ricans, especially, humor is a way of survival, right? And I think that's true about a lot of Black and brown cultures. And I see that in a lot of the literatures. And so I do, like, there are moments where I'm like, that's kind of funny. Well, like you gotta pat yourself on the back. It's kind of embarrassing to say, but it's, but you have fun. You have fun as you write it. And so those are fun places to be in the novel. There's a lot of other places that are hard.
I think too, I mean, sometimes it's just reflexive when you're laughing at the thing that is horrific because you don't know what else to do. It sounds very counterintuitive, but there are times where you're just like, I don't know what else to do. I don't know how else to respond to this
Yeah.
piece of information because I've never experienced something like that. But I do want listeners to understand that there is a big beating heart in what happened to Ruthy Ramirez. And I know you and I have covered a lot of ground where people are like, wait, am I listening to a history pod? What is that? No, this is what art and literature is supposed to do, right? Like, you're supposed to be able to capture the moment that we live in and like reflect it back at us and just be like, oh, hi, you may not have
Yeah,
noticed this.
absolutely.
Have you had time to read anything else? I mean, I realize your novel is coming out into the world. You teach. There's a million things going on. You probably have already started the next book, but have you read anything lately that has just knocked your socks off?
Oh my God, yes. I read Post Traumatic by Chantel, I
Oh,
think
yeah.
Johnson is the last name. And I just think that novel was just so good. Also a Puerto Rican writer, so that was exciting to see. It's kind of wild because there's two other Puerto Rican writers coming out, Melissa Cosequino and Jennifer Maritza Macaulay are coming out with books at the same time. That never happens, right? Like, it never happens that three Puerto Rican women are publishing at a big five and coming out in the same season. So I'm really looking forward to those books as well. I got the arc for Yellowface the other day.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Have you started reading it yet?
I have, and we're going to be live on stage in May.
Oh my God. The first few pages, I haven't, and obviously no spoilers, but I was just laughing the first few pages. I mean, it's also one of those difficult books that balances attention between the serious and humor, so that has been really fun to go back to.
Yeah, it's a really exciting moment. I mean, we don't always do everything perfectly, but to see more voices being added to what's being published is, I mean, as a bookseller, it's It's wicked exciting. Sorry, my Boston comes flying out every now and again.
Hey.
You know, if you can represent the island from South Carolina,
Yeah.
you know, I can. We just need as much noise as we can get and as much noise as we can make. And I think it's delightful. And there's also a new Esmeralda Santiago novel coming in August, which I'm totally stoked about. Las Madres is coming, and then Xochitl Gonzalez's Olga Dies Dreaming is out in paperback, which, you know, she's doing a little bit of what you're doing too, that balance of humor and, I mean, there's some stuff that happens in that book where you're just like, oh.
It's a very Puerto Rican characteristic, the balance between humor and tragedy. It's something, you know, that's our people.
Given what I know about the history of Puerto Rico, I mean, my book club read War Against All Puerto Ricans.
Yeah.
Which I highly recommend if you need like a basic history of mainland U.S. relationship with Puerto Rico. It is absolutely worth reading. Nelson Dennis's book. It's not an easy read, but really important, especially if you want to know what we're doing. Like as Americans, like we should know these things. We really should know these things. Are you working on the next novel?
You know, I am, and I'm working on like two things.
Okay.
And I don't know which one will win. It's like, you know, like what it's like you're taking care of one kid and then you're like, oh no, that kid is eating.
Yeah.
You know, like, so I'm like trying to like figure out what to do with it, but it's so at the early stages, you know, but I'm excited. I want to go back and play. I'm excited to write again, you know?
Okay. Before I let you go though, can we talk about the Puerto Rican Literature Project? You're the co-founder of this. And I think it's really cool. And I don't feel like I knew about it until I started doing my homework for this episode. So can we talk about this? Because it's an online resource. It's available to everyone. It's really kind of groovy. So would you just riff on that a little bit?
Yes, most definitely. Okay, so the Puerto Rican Literature Project is a digital archive. We recently received over $1 million from the Mellon Foundation over the next over 3 years. We have one more year left in the grant cycle to create this digital archive, which is basically documenting the lives of Puerto Rican writers. The team, I should say who they are because it's important, you know, but is USLDH at the University of Houston. And I work with a team of other Puerto Rican scholars and writers, Erika Olivares Pesante, Ricardo Maldonado, Ricardo Rivera, Gabby and Caro at USLDH are amazing. I mean, they're original founders, not original founders, but basically at Arte Publico, Gabby's, the head. So right under Nick, but so these people it's a big team, and we also have Ana Castillo Munoz and Anna Portnoy Brimmer. And it's important to mention all of these people because the project's enormous, and we're working and interviewing hundreds of poets. The goal is to get 700 poets on the site by next year, and we're interviewing poets in the diaspora and in the archipelago. We're focusing on poetry the first phase, and then it's going to be fiction the second phase.
See, this makes me really happy. This just the idea that this exists and you guys are just making sure that it gets out into the world. My eyes are getting really big as I talk about this because it's a cool project.
Yeah,
it's such a cool project.
And we were over in Houston working on it on the metadata, which is the less sexy portion of the Digital Humanities Project.
We live in a data-driven world. We can't ignore it. I would love to ignore it, and I just can't. So, I mean,
you're right. Oh my God, yeah.
We do what we can. We tell stories. We give people, a little bit of laughter and a little bit of, hey, could you think about this for 5 minutes? Because it's uncomfortable, but it's worth knowing, and it's worth understanding, and it's worth knowing these characters. I mean, seriously, Nina, Jessica, Ruthy. It's really, I mean, there's some fun stuff. We're going to drop, obviously, the other books that we talked about. We're going to drop them in the show notes because I think they're pretty important. And Post-Traumatic was a great read.
Yes, yeah.
And this is where I get to say thank you so much for making the time. Claire,
can I mention one last book?
Yes, totally, of course.
I wanted to also mention another Puerto Rican writer, my dear friend, Xavier Navarro Aquino, who wrote Lorio. And so he wrote this last year, and it's an excellent book talking about Hurricane Maria, sort of mythical. So it's a great book. I recommend for folks to read it.
We definitely need that in the show notes, and I will get them in there. Claire Jiménez, thank you so much. What Happened to Ruthy Ramirez is out now, and everyone should read it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I've been so looking forward to this taping. And actually, we're taping on Valentine's Day, even though you guys are going to be listening to this in March. Mm-hmm. Elaine Hsieh Chou is the author of Disorientation. And if somehow you did not read it when it came out in hardcover last year, this is an academic satire that you do not want to miss. And Elaine, I'm so happy to see you, but I'm going to ask you to introduce Disorientation to our listeners.
Thank you so much for having me, Miwa. Disorientation is, you could call it a campus satire. Mm-hmm. I get a lot of feedback that it's not satire and it's real, but I'm like, I love that too. So is it satire? I still don't even know, but it's I hope funny, and it follows Ingrid Yang. She's a PhD student studying a very famous Chinese American poet, Xiao Chou. But we find out she never wanted to research him in the first place, and she's in her 8th year of her PhD program, about to be sort of kicked out after this year. What happens is she finds this mysterious note in the Xiao Chou archives, and it sends her down this wild goose chase. She thinks she's found the key to her dissertation, but it actually is much bigger than that. And what happens afterwards is she really has to confront the things she believes, sort of the life she thought she wanted, all the relationships around her. Really, she has to confront herself, and I think look in the mirror in a way that a lot of us could happily live our lives and not look in the mirror. So yeah, I would say it's a journey of her sort of self-discovery.
I really love Ingrid, but there were moments where she frustrated me, and I get exactly who she is and where she's coming from. So I don't want anyone to think that, I didn't like Ingrid, but I did have some moments where I was like, okay, girl. And you and I are going to stay spoiler free, even though we are talking about the paperback of your book. There is so much gleeful discovery, and there's so many great things happened in this book. And some of them are terrible great, and some of them are great. But I think I was laughing really, really hard as I read it. But there were also a couple of times where I had to put it down because it hit a little close to a couple of nerves. And I'm glad you hit those nerves, but I still had to put it down for a minute and give myself space for a second. And I think, it's interesting you just said, though, that there are people who don't think of this as a satire, and yet I just reread the book, obviously prepping for this. So I've read it twice now, and I don't know if I agree that it's not a satire, because you have some really big set pieces, some really big, satisfying set pieces. And there's some characters where it feels like, oh, maybe you haven't dialed it up to 11. This is just reality. We have all met some of the folks in your book in real life, whether we liked it or not. You have this big heart, this big sense of humor, and I feel like you pull back just in time in a couple of places where, shall we say, people break into other people's houses. There's some caper flick stuff that happens in this book, and there's some friendship stuff that happens because our girl Ingrid is evolving, and luckily she does evolve. But she has some moments where I'm like, don't be the one who can only be the only Asian in the room. Don't be that. Don't be that person, Ingrid.
Yeah, for most of her life, that was her identity. Be the only Asian.
I mean, even when she's like, well, I don't want to eat Asian snacks. It's like, well, then you're missing out on the tasty stuff. So that's just more for the rest of us. I did have moments. I mean, Ingrid grows up in Massachusetts. Her parents are the only immigrants for miles around, let alone the only Asian immigrants. And she's part of a program. She's part of the East Asian Studies department at this tiny college that is not known for a lot except for the archive of this poet that she ends up studying, and she doesn't even really want to. And can we talk about her professor? Can we talk about Michael for a second? I'm gonna let you introduce him, because I have feelings about this guy.
Michael Bartholomew. I feel like there is one in every East Asian Studies department across America. What am I saying? Across the globe. Even in Asia, they're there. So I taught ESL after I graduated from undergrad. I went to Taiwan and lived there for a year. And Michael really epitomizes this type of white man that I would meet in Taiwan, who is perfectly fluent in Mandarin, and probably another Asian language, and likes to lord it over you, and has memorized all these facts about Asia, and likes to also lord that over you. Usually is married to an Asian woman and uses that as extra proof he's somehow, I don't know, Asian on the inside. It's very frustrating when these men use their partners and children as a way to sort of prove something about themselves. But I think they make Asia their personality. And I just found that so ridiculous that one could take an entire culture and try to make it their entire life, when a culture is not something, it's not like a hobby. They're everywhere. And I think because they're everywhere in all these departments and they have a lot of power, they end up shaping narratives about Asia, and they publish a lot of books about, you know, these definitive academic texts, quote unquote, explaining what Asia is to presumably a white audience, and they really frustrate me. And so when I created Michael, I really wanted, it was my chance to sort of reveal him for the ridiculous figure that he is.
There's this presumption of authority that makes me itch. It just makes me itch. And, you know, small example, but if you're digging around for translations of Japanese folklore and mythology, even in the US in 2022, 2023, the vast majority of translations are all done by men, white men. And I'm just kind of like, hi, I'm pretty sure there are Japanese people, Japanese Americans, Japanese who can also translate. And some of them might even be women. And, you know, when you consider the feminine in Japanese folklore and Japanese mythology, you know, and also Tale of Genji was the first novel ever written, and it was written by a woman. But hey, tiny things, tiny things. And, you know, having been an Asian studies major in college on the East Coast, I mean, we didn't have Asian American studies. It didn't exist on the East Coast when I was in school. So yeah, it hits a little close to the bone. And then we have Ingrid's boyfriend, Stephen.
Oh, Stephen, yeah. He's I feel the younger generation of Michael. So he's maybe not as obsessed with, you know, ancient China, but he fixates on Japan. And this is something that I've just joked a lot about with my Asian friends, is that for whatever reason, a lot of people who have an obsession with Asia choose Japan as their entryway. And Stephen is, I think, of that generation that's, I don't know. I don't really say that he reads manga or watches anime, but that sort of genre, you know, or maybe that sort of hipster white dude who's really into Kurosawa films or something, you know.
Kurosawa and, you know, Tanizaki short stories, but not the Makioka sisters, but definitely, you know, the creepy weird stories, Shore and Mishima, you know.
Oh, and Murakami. Yeah, they love
Murakami.
I remember this became another running joke, is when I would meet guys like this, I don't know, and they even dress a certain way, and they all have like the same glasses. And then I was working at a bookstore in Brooklyn, and one of my coworkers was sort of this type. Maybe I shouldn't be saying, but anyways, one day I just heard him saying, favorite author is Murakami, and I've read like every single, and was like recommending him to a customer, and I almost like tripped on myself and was like, of course the pieces all come together. Why are you all the same? Please be more original.
But we're talking about performance art. I mean, it's all a level of performance art. And again, it's this presumption of authority, and it's this presumption of understanding. And the thing that you did for Stephen, that I don't know if I'm still rolling my eyes or if I'm still, dude's a fake translator. Dude does not speak Japanese, and yet gets a contract to translate a Japanese novel. And he basically writes an English version of this book that makes no sense. Yeah. And of course the sex scenes get twice as long and everything else gets left out. And it's like, oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And that's where we see translation as discourse, and it's not an invisible sort of, vessel or what have you, there is always some distortion. There is always some subjective means to an end, I think.
And Ingrid's bookended herself with these two dudes. She's bookended herself with Stephen, her fiance,
Mm-hmm.
and Michael, her thesis advisor. I guess we could call him a mentor, but I mean, I can't really imagine being mentored by this dude. I'm just going to sit here and make faces for a second because of this dude. Certainly they're not the only piece of her orbit. There are women in this book who are offended. There's Eunice, her best friend, who I had a couple of moments with Eunice where I was like, okay, sweetie, we need to talk. And Vivian, who I love. I love Vivian. She strikes me as she should be 6 foot tall, and she's probably not, but she really does have that larger than life personality. But I want to talk about the women for a second. They're much stronger together than they are apart. They don't really realize that until, a good chunk of the way into the book. But I'm assuming Ingrid shows up first, and then Vivian and Eunice show up sort of as they need to as you're writing. But am I right about that?
Yeah, no, you're very much right. So I wrote 3 different versions of the novel.
Okay.
From scratch, because each time I thought I had failed. Yeah, I wrote, the first version and then hated it and was like, I'm never gonna write a novel. I failed, and then tried again a few months later, wrote it all in the first person. So in the very first version, Ingrid she's in her 50s and she's married to a congressman and they have 2 children. So it was a completely different I mean, she's still a professor researching Chou, but in the second version, she's, I think, 35, and she has this sort of love-hate relationship with a student named Jeremy Nguyen, who's a really big activist on campus. He's the only Asian student in the Black Student Union. His girlfriend's also a Black activist. And so he sort of looks at someone like Ingrid and thinks, well, she's just sort of a lost cause, right? Well, she has this attraction to him, and I thought it ended up being a little too pat for her sort of nemesis to be the one she falls for. So Jeremy's character became Vivian and then Alex, sort of both, he separated into both of them. And I'm so glad that happened, because I really, I think I needed both of them, Vivian and Alex. And then it was in the third version, I realized Ingrid was just doing so much alone. And I was like, I haven't given her a friend. So
she needed a friend.
It took until, the third.
She needed she needed someone to be her partner in, well, kind of crime.
Yeah.
And she needed a partner in crime. She needed someone to be like, sweetie, let's do your hair or something, which wasn't always the most opportune moment, but sometimes you need a friend who's like, just step away.
Yeah.
Sit down.
And I thought it would be so fun for Ingrid to have this friend who's the polar opposite of her in her upbringing, because I feel we haven't seen, I think, as much representation of Asians who have grown up in huge Asian enclaves, like in the San Gabriel Valley, where Eunice is from. And I think we all have hangups, but their hangups are a little different. And friends I've talked to who grew up in these sorts of towns would feel actually a lot of anxiety and insecurity over not being completely fluent in their mother tongue. That was the cool standard. And that blew my mind, because where I grew up was mostly white. That was not cool. You didn't want to be able to be perfectly bilingual. You'd be sort of made fun of for that. And I thought it was beautiful and incredible that flipped. Well, not that kids should feel insecure about anything, but I was like, I love that universe, and imagining a character who grew up in that world and doesn't have the hangups Ingrid has.
Yeah, and Ingrid, she sort of bounces back and forth between being really hard on herself, which I wish she would do less of. I really wish she would be less terrible to herself. And I can only imagine eating that many antacids and that many allergy pills. How
insides must be a mess.
Completely. But watching her do this, I'm like, oh yeah, that is kind of her answer to everything. Take an antacid and ignore it. And it's like, well, sweetie, you kind of can't. It's kind of a lot bigger than that. But to have Eunice there as sort of a check in a way, because Ingrid's not really letting anyone else in. That tick that Stephen has where he's constantly saying dear every time he talks to Ingrid. Is he channeling like a 65-year-old white woman? Like
I'm patronizing.
Yeah, it's one of those words where I'm like, I mean, I have very sarcastically said that to my partner.
Dear.
We all have moments where we say something very sarcastically to our person, and dear can, it can be deployed carefully. But Stephen's just using it with abandon, and I'm thinking, who is this guy? And he's who he is, and Ingrid chooses to be with him. And for a while, she's very happy being engaged to him. I do love the fact that her dad is not so thrilled.
Yeah.
Go Baba. Go Baba. Baba.
He knows what's up. Yeah.
He does.
What are you doing with this clown? Is what he's basically thinking the whole time.
So 3 different versions from scratch. Ingrid is the most consistent piece of it, whether she's 50 or 35, or she is sort of the whole of it. So when did you know you had Ingrid's voice? Because it's a tricky voice. It's a great voice, but it's tricky. She's not simple. She's not hanging out in the corner going, okay, well, what's next? It's more a matter of, oh, sweetie.
Yeah.
Oh, sweetie. There's a lot of, oh, sweetie.
Oh, sweetie. Right.
Oh.
I know. A lot of people want to shake her by the shoulders, which I get. I really needed the reader to hang in there with me to be like, don't give up on her. It's coming, but she is very frustrating. So that the voice was really, really hard. I struggled a long time with that. So in the first version, it's in the third person, a little more omniscient, with this narrator who's very snarky. And I had recently read The Sellout by Paul Beatty, and I was enamored. And I think that version was me trying to be Paul Beatty.
Yeah.
And, there's only one Paul Beatty. So I think I I couldn't find what my voice was for Ingrid. And then in the first person, I think it really helped me to be in her head. But as I found out after I wrote, 70,000 words, finished that version, it really doesn't work because she's so clueless. Yeah. And you need, when you're in the first person, how do you have that distance to show sort of how she could be interacting with the world, but how she's not? You're just already in her head. And so I realized, okay, I have to go back to the third person. And I feel like there's a certain comic voice that you can see in A Confederacy of Dunces and Penin, where this character is sort of inherently comic in that they are just at almost living in their own bubble, bumbling through the world. And we can see them as the slightly ridiculous figure they are. But at the same time, I think in both those novels, there is a great tenderness for this character, right? We're still meant to empathize with them. So I think there aren't a lot of books that do that. And I really struggled with finding that voice. How can I gently sort of portray Ingrid in a way where we see, oh, why are you doing that? Your life could be so different, but at the same time, not to be so harsh to her that we don't understand what she's going through. And yeah, it took a while to find that exact sort of sweet spot.
Ingrid's bubble feels very real, though, and I think there are a lot, and not just Asian Americans, but I think for any non-white, and I'm going to use a giant umbrella term, but I think there are lots of folks who, they're struggling with where we are as a country, where we are as a society, where we are. I mean, language changes. There are people that have a hard time with changes in language. There are people who have a hard time in structural changes. And, obviously a lot of folks have been doing a lot of work to make significant structural changes, whether it's financial or housing, or there's so much going on in the States right now. And it felt very real and very organic for her to sort of be a little clueless. Not every single one of us is banging on a door saying, we've got to change, we've got to change. She's just sort of trying to live her life. And she's given herself these guardrails, right? Like, I'm supposed to be engaged. I'm supposed to get a PhD. She's just set up all of this stuff, and none of it seems to particularly be bringing her any kind of joy.
Exactly. Yeah. I think Ingrid really clamped on to that model minority upward mobility lie that we were all sold to sort of be that the closest you could have to safety, true safety in America, is to be white adjacent in the sense of seek that sort of upward mobility, but keep your head down. Don't ask for too much. And obviously, you're not going to get promoted anyway. They just sort of want you to do the busy work and not take their power. And so Ingrid, I think, I think a lot of Asian Americans have fell into this sort of life path. Sometimes it's pressure from, it could be all different reasons, but I wanted Ingrid to realize that's not what brings you happiness. And she really struggles with basically acting out other people's expectations. One of the myths I really wanted to combat is that Asian women are apparently inherently submissive and obedient and whatnot. Yeah, which I think is so hilarious when you have you met any Asian woman?
I think of my coterie of women and cousins and friends and everything, and I'm just like, nope. Not even the 8-year-old. Not even the 8-year-old. And I showed up with this personality. This submissive is just not.
Yeah, when you turn on, the TV or you go to the movie, that's how we're portrayed, like literally bowing half the time and giggling, behind our hands, unable to make eye contact. Like that's how, I don't know, timid and docile we're portrayed as. So I wanted to show she is not inherently, none of us are inherently like that, but this is what happens when the discourse around who you should be, what you're allowed to be, is so overwhelming that she doesn't have the ability to question it and just adopts what other people put onto her and sort of mirrors it back. And I think that's what it means to be complicit, right? And it's so hard to liberate yourself, the box people have written for you, and to the boldness it takes to reimagine that. It's not easy. And I think it takes a lot of us many years, and the younger generation, that's why I'm envious of them, because this kind of talk and this discourse, it's on TikTok, and they, I think, have a cursory understanding of it, but for my generation, it's like pain of just gradually unlearning everything I'd been taught.
It always gets me too when I see someone sort of attempting the model minority life, where I'm just like, we didn't choose this for ourselves, right? This is a label that was ascribed to us by people who are not us, as a tool to use against people who are also not us. And I'm like, I'm not someone's chess piece.
Right.
I'm not your chess piece. And what? It's so frustrating to me when I see people. And we see it in the community where we've got folks who are buying into, I'm not woke, or I'm not, and I'm using buzzwords for particular effect. But, I don't believe in cancel culture. I don't believe in this. I don't believe in that. And I just want to flip it back and say, well, do you believe in evolution? Because things can change. And sometimes, sometimes we move, we change trajectory a little bit, or we, our orbit shifts, like pick whatever metaphor you want, but maybe it's not moving against something. Maybe it's moving forward towards something that's better. And that shift is really hard for some people. It is so hard for some people. And I'm just thinking of Timothy, our buddy Timothy.
Oh, Timothy.
Yeah, he means well. And we've all met a dude like this. Again, we've all met a guy like this.
They're in office. Yeah. They keep winning. The Timothys of our community are winning more and more elections. And I'm just, it's terrifying. Community is always full of multitudes. And so every community has people who are on every side of the spectrum. So it's weird, because at the same time, I'm like, am I being sort of unfair in saying we should all be united on this side? Or do I owe it to my community to recognize that we are full of multitudes? And so if some of us are Trump supporting, gun toting, is this equality so that we can be as bad as white Republicans? These are questions that keep me up at night, Miwa.
Yeah, well, luckily you write fiction about them. I do think all of this needs to be turned into art, whether it's film, whether it's music, whether it's books, obviously, are my preference. But they're conversations that I wish we were having. I would love to see us just be able to write about whatever we feel like writing about. I would like to see the multitudes represented, because I'm not going to pretend that we don't exist the way we exist. We are complicated. We are layered. Some of us are immigrants. Some of us are not. Some of us want to move towards the future, and some of us certainly do not. But we're all here. And if we're not having the conversations, there's almost no Venn diagram in some parts of our communities. And I'm just looking at this going, what is wrong with us?
What's wrong with us?
Why are we not go ahead. You really want to give money to that? Okay, fine. I can't stop you. But can we at least have the conversation? And we are so shut down in so many ways. And Vivian is a character I love. She is the absolute polar opposite of Timothy, but she does pay a price for her activism and her belief. And when I say she pays a price, it's just her physical health, her emotional health, her relationships. She's absolutely fighting what she believes in, and I absolutely respect that. But wow, it takes a toll on her. And that's another piece of the conversation we have to have is we've got the same people fighting all of the battles at once, and other people saying, well, I just can't do that, or that's not convenient, or that doesn't impact me, so I'm not going to do it. And I'm just kind of looking at everyone going, well, if everyone did a little bit, it would be less stressful for all of the people who are doing all of the work.
Right. For Vivian. Yeah. Activist burnout. We don't talk enough about how you'll see an activist. Like I remember, during Ferguson 2014, you'd see videos of them, standing up, speaking at protests. And then, at every sort of police shooting, it would happen again in 2016, of course, and then 2020. But a lot of these activists we don't hear from again, because it is such a heavy position to be put in, to carry the weight of justice for your entire community. And I wanted to show with Vivian that there is this fine line between taking care of others and then taking care of yourself. And I remember at one point, nothing as extreme, but I think because when I was doing more organizing and when I was sort of more publicly speaking out against injustices, I had sort of put myself into this position where suddenly, if something tragic happened and I didn't stand up and say something, it became, oh, do people think I don't care anymore? Do people think I have become desensitized? Or it suddenly felt like I didn't know how to balance not wanting to watch, for example, very brutal, violent videos, and then find the emotional energy to write about why it upset me, and then to find the resources of how we could try to, I was at one point looking up all the police department, creating emails, you could, just fill in this email and say why we need justice for this person. And it took a toll on me. I don't know how any of us can feasibly do, because activism is a job, but it is such an emotional job, and people take that for granted. People think it's easy to just show up at a protest and talk on top of a trash can, but you don't know what's behind that person's life. You don't know if they're breaking down the minute after. We look up to them as pinnacles of strength, so then they carry another burden of people who don't feel able to publicly do something, and then they think we're relying on them. I don't know the answer, but I just knew with Vivian I could try to show something I think we don't talk about, which is long-term activism is rare. Many people bow out for different reasons.
The book is divided into 4 parts. It's essentially, it goes through the year: fall, winter, spring, summer. And I love some of the chapter heads. They were a treat. They were totally a treat. Good. But one of the things I really appreciated reading Disorientation is the fact that the characters are real. And yes, we've made fun of Michael, and we've made fun of Stephen and Timothy, and, here we've got the women as well. And, Ingrid, I love her, but there were a couple moments, I'm not going to pretend, there were a couple of moments where I was like, oh, come on, Ingrid, get it together. But you're not writing about caricatures. These are, and again, this comes back to something you said very early in the show, which is there are people who do not consider this satire. And I think that is a legitimate point of view. I'm just saying that for me as a reader, I did not feel that way. I felt like everything was on 11 for a reason. And, the laughter got me through some of the stuff where I'm like, oh, yeah. And one of the things you do too is that Ingrid's parents are not pushy. They are not those parents. You have freed us. You have freed us from, yes, the immigrant parent trope, which I would be perfectly happy if we all just stopped doing. I don't care where your parents came from, like that and stinky lunchboxes. Like, I'm sorry, but can we stop with the stinky lunchbox thing? Because it's not stinky just because the kid's sitting down. Like, that's their issue, not yours. Like, stop with the stinky lunch. Also, I didn't even get to bring my lunch to school because I went to day school and they served us lunch. And if I never have to eat chop suey again, which is elbow macaroni, hamburger, and tomato sauce, like, yeah, I'm good, thanks. I don't know what this is. I don't want to eat it, but I don't have a choice because this is what you're feeding me today. Okay. Why is it called chop suey?
I have no idea. That's the first time I've heard of this.
I think it's a weird East Coast thing. Many of the things from my childhood, I just ascribe to being weird East Coast things because I don't have an explanation otherwise.
I just had a really terrible because I just thought if it looks sort of gross or unappetizing and that's why it was called that. I learned just the other day that a restaurant in Louisiana in the 90s went out of business because other restaurant owners started this rumor that they serve dog meat. And I feel part of the myth of dog meat is using words like chop suey or mushu. Like I think like if you're from Chinese cultures, you're like, I've never heard of a chop suey. I've never heard of a mushu. Anyways, I thought that was really depressing and also absurd that would be so difficult to procure. Like, you know how easy it is to get chicken and like beef? Like, why would you go out of your way to try to?
I got nothing. I'm just going to sit here kind of in horrified awe. That's othering on steroids. And I mean, obviously othering is a piece of but the dreaded other. Ingrid kind of doesn't know she's been othered. We need to talk about Ingrid and the other thing for a second because she could do better than this dude, Steven. She really could.
Oh, yeah.
And yet she's settled and she's being othered by her person, which, ew. But she's okay with it. She's not leaving.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a lot of relationships out there where if the woman is Asian, for example, and the man is white, like he has a pattern of dating just Asian women. And I've heard different justifications of why they would like to stay with this man. Yeah, who am I to judge the personal relationship, I guess? But for Ingrid, this was part of her journey in terms of she thinks Steven is all she can get in a way. I mean, I think the fact that he's white, it's her a lot of internalized messaging growing up in white America that I think we the surface level is people say, oh, Western beauty standards. I'm like, it's deeper than that. It's about evil and good. Literally, Chinese people, our first introduction to this country in the 1800s were that we were evil. And we were portrayed as like monster serpent-like looking creatures in all these propaganda photos. And that I truly think has never gone away. I think Yellow Peril, we see it crop up all the time. This Chinese spy balloon.
Oh,
I don't know.
No, I'm right there with you. I was like,
right, satire. I'm just like, is this satire? This is why the fear of Yellow Peril has never left since its inception. And so I think Ingrid and so many Chinese Americans, Taiwanese Americans internalized that America, white America, is the hero. They're the goodness that can save you from the, evil, whatever, China that we want to ban and, send back to China and whatnot. Anyway, so Ingrid has all of that inside her when she decides to consistently date white men that suck and I think don't deserve to touch a hair on her head. And I wanted to show the flip side, like the pain of, I think, Asian men who were interested in her past that she just shut out completely. But yeah, so there are all these messy reasons why she ends up with a guy like Steven and why I think a lot of Asian and not just women, it's across genders, can end up with people who you don't know if they actually objectify you behind sort of, closed doors.
Ingrid needs to start asking questions. And I think that's the beauty of so much of what happens in Disorientation, is because when she starts asking questions, you can sort of mentally see her eyes getting really big. There's a lot of, oh, what just happened? And she's not fully prepared for consequences.
Mm-hmm.
She's not fully prepared for her own responses to things. I mean, in some ways, she's really immature, which I wasn't expecting. I mean, she's 29, she's in the 8th year of her PhD, I mean, obviously, grad school was never going to happen for me. But at the same time, I'm kind of like, oh, you are really young. And it's kind of refreshing to see, because if she had all the answers, we'd have a little less fun.
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense that she was a little older, just purely for the generational thing. I think her being younger, because the book is set in 2016, and I think for her to be younger, that Vivian's a few years younger, and so she captures growing up more with the internet and in tune with sort of just what's going on in the world in a way that Ingrid isn't. I wanted to show it makes more sense the older you are, the more you are entrenched in a way of thinking. And you really have to challenge yourself to unlearn things, I think, when you're older versus when you're younger, you're just maybe more naturally exposed to them. And so it's not as necessarily as much work. Yes, but Ingrid, the most terrible thing to happen to her that could happen to her has to happen for her to finally have her awakening. And if she hadn't made that discovery, I fear poor Ingrid would right now be married to Steve.
Yes, but luckily for us, you had control of the narrative. Did writing Disorientation change you?
Oh, Miwa, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, writing Disorientation was me slowly trying to unpack my relationship to my identity, my relationship to white men, white institutions, my relationship to my childhood. So I think not that to conflate me with Ingrid, but I think Disorientation was in a way my ode to parts of Asian American reckonings. And that happened, I think, in those years around 2016, before and after. A lot of us, I think, had to, with someone like Trump, and then now with all the COVID induced hate crimes, it's how can any of us think we are safe in this country, or that the model minority myth is the thing that's going to save us, and keeping our heads down and not complaining is going to save us. And so I had been reading a lot of things, collecting little tidbits of history, and I would just copy and paste document. And I was on Reddit. I was reading some scary stuff there. Read a little about the MR Asian group, and terrifying. And at the same time, I understand I understand that pain is real, where it stems from. And it obviously is then comes out in a toxic way, but absolutely the pain is real. And all of these things that were knocking around in my head as I was learning about activist spaces and learning to be in them and to shut up and be an ally. Maybe I did too much, it was like to put it all in Ingrid's story. But it was all the things that I wanted to talk about with my community. And it has been so great to open the door to these sort of sticky conversations. And, many people have told me, I've heard that exact same line about redheads, Italian, it's normal to have racial preferences. Just knowing people feel seen, and knowing that, as if we bring this out in the open, I hope it is that much harder to fly under the radar, and that men like Stephen in their personal lives, but also professional lives, who are, I think, taking away opportunities from us and profiting off of us, I hope they can be called out for what they are. I hope, we can have these honest conversations about what we have at stake is always not even greater. It's just we have things at stake and they don't. And so I think when it comes to talking about making art, it must be said, things change if you have something at stake.
And I would just like us to get as many stories out there as possible. I think that's a big piece of it, is just why can't we have messy domestic dramas, and why can't we have academic satires, or why can't we just have comedic novels that kind of make you sit and go, okay, I'm laughing, but maybe am I supposed to be laughing at this? I just want us to be able to tell the range of stories. And for a really
Yes.
long time, we've been ascribed a certain role, and that role is not interesting. And I really would just like to see us do whatever we feel like doing whenever we feel like doing it. And if some people are made uncomfortable by that, well, life can be interesting and
Yeah, and we have
messy.
to be able to disagree with each other. I think there's such a fear that if we publicly air our disagreements, we will never achieve sort of a united liberation. But I think that it would be so dangerous to erase the differences between us. And I think, have you seen the newest season of Atlanta?
I haven't, and I need to. It is queued
Okay,
up.
I won't mention it. Okay,
Okay.
there's a few episodes, especially one, I think that's called Mr. Chocolate.
Yeah, I have.
Oh, have you heard of it?
I have, and there is. Oh, you and I could keep going for a while.
Yeah,
but
it's an example of when you're acknowledging, like with Donald Glover, I think in the Black community, there is division, and which is natural among any, as we talked about, if you're human, this is what happens. I would love us to be able to make art that can shine a light, right, on those messy parts of ourselves that don't fit into these neat little boxes. Yeah, I really hope. I'm with you. I'm trying to get it there, my little corner of the universe. I'm trying to write the messy.
Yeah, well, I'm going to shout out your story that just ran in the Atlantic Background, which, if listeners have not read it yet, go find it. It's fantastic. It's part of your story collection that's coming out in 2024, which I have seen you tease as kind of a genre busting, I'm playing with lots of stuff, I'm doing interesting stuff, and I am dying to read this book. Also, background, it's a terrific story. It's unexpected in some ways. It is a father-daughter story that I have not seen before. And right there, I really respect a lot of the choices you made. And yes, I'm not going to spoil this. It's a short story. Go find the short story. You can read it very quickly. But it's fantastic. It is absolutely fantastic. And it was really wild to read. I just didn't know what to expect. I was like, well, here's this new story. Okay. And the entire time I could not stop reading. And yes, short stories are designed, to be devoured quickly, but this was, I love this story. So I can't wait, does the story collection have a title?
Yeah, it's called Where Are You Really From?
Oh yes, that line.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of all you can do when you hear that line, is just start to laugh.
Just laugh and slowly walk away as you continue laughing. I think.
Yeah, or you just have fun and say Boston and watch people. What? Like, no, really.
Yeah, and
No,
then
seriously.
Just keep going. Like, do you want the address of the hospital where I was? What you want? Where I was conceived? And I got this question so often in France. I just started...
Oh no, that is no.
They phrase it as your origine. That's how they. What are your origine? And so I actually just started saying I don't answer that question.
Yeah.
And they would be like, why? Like, because I think they think they're owed this information as if it's public info. I don't know, but I would just say political reasons, and then they didn't know what to say. But so that, I don't know, if anyone has been struggling with that, maybe you could try this. Just, answer for political reasons. Let them do what they will with that. But thank you for shouting that out. And well, I mean, I'm still revising. We'll see if it comes out in 2024. Maybe it'll be 2025, but fingers crossed.
We can be patient. It's okay, Elaine. We have Disorientation. We can hang out for a minute. And also, Disorientation you're working on the teleplay, right? It's been adapted?
On the film adaptation.
Oh, film. Okay, so it is film. I wasn't sure if it was a limited series or film, but so that's coming at some point. So it's not like you're going anywhere. We know where to find you. And I don't mean that in a creepy, weird way. I mean in a yay, let's create all of the art. Let's have all of the conversations, even if they make us itch a little bit. And,
Yes.
because honestly, the way we've been doing it has not been working well for a lot of us. So why don't we just change how we engage and when we engage and what we're doing, and see if maybe that gets us to a different place or something, because we can do better. We really can.
Yeah, and we have, I think, is the thing. Our history as Asian Americans and the activism in the 60s and before and after, so much of that has been also kept from us. And I had to learn as an adult. No one taught me in school. So I hope it's us recognizing, oh, we have been trying to subvert the system. We have been holding space for ourselves, taking care of ourselves and not relying on these other institutions. And so I hope we can feel inspired by our past too, when it comes to, what lies ahead.
If you look at what we were doing in the 60s and 70s, model minority is not a phrase that comes to mind. And there's some great photographs and there's some great literature. Like, there's a lot of stuff that I would love to see some younger generations hit up, because there's a lot of really interesting folks who did interesting stuff that I think not everyone knows about.
Yeah, I'll shout
Read
out
a book.
I Hotel. I Hotel by Karen Tay and Nishida. Incredible. That was how I found out a lot about the history of Asian American activism, which is what she did, like years of archival research. Yes. So if people who are listening want to know more about this period, that's such a great book. That it's fiction, but it also is like this sort of beautiful ode, I think, to this real, like, non-fictional ode to our history. I would love to see a movie. I was thinking that would be so cool to see a period piece of Asian American activism, and even just sort of the collaboration with Black activists, and then someone like Richard Aoki, is that how you pronounce his last name? I think he's a really fascinating figure too, that who knows? I mean, he when he passed away, I think he took so many secrets with him, and fascinating stuff. Yeah, I think me and you could talk for
we definitely could.
Sorry, I keep getting
No. It's totally great. No, it's totally great. But yeah, maybe we should just do a whole different series. But oh wait, no. Okay, hold on. Dialing it back. Elaine Hsieh Chou, thank you so much. Disorientation is a treat. It's a roller coaster ride. It is all of the things you want in a novel, including a couple of moments where you want to put it down for a second and think about what you just read. But for the most part, it is just wild fun. Wild fun. Thank you so much for this book. And thank you for joining us on Poured Over.
Thank you, Miwa. This was so wonderful getting to know you. And it just felt like talking with a friend. Thank you.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Topoff. We've got a couple of great books to recommend based off of today's double shot episode. I've got two fantastic booksellers recommending books today. So Jamie, Madyson, take it away.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Jamie. I'm coming to you from my home store in Leawood, Kansas. You can follow me at BN Leawood KS. If you had to keep turning pages to find out what happened to Ruthy Ramirez, you might also be interested in reading Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson. This is another multi-generational family drama with a mystery at its core. There are two siblings who are estranged, and they come together after the death of their mother. And she leaves behind a lengthy audio recording full of revelations, including a half-sister that they didn't know about, some instructions for them, and a frozen piece of black cake, which is a traditional cake served at Caribbean Christmas celebrations. And it's filled with this delicious mixture of fruit and rum and spices. And in the book, the cake is a cake, but it also serves as a symbol, right, of the blending across cultures, across the incredibly mixed up life of this woman, their mother, Eleanor. But maybe she's not Eleanor. Maybe that's not even her name. Maybe she's not just their mother. Maybe she's a frightened teenager named Covey, a Black woman with a Chinese father who is about to be married off to a local creep on a Caribbean island. Maybe she's a murder suspect in love with a boy that she can't be with, who escapes to London, where she meets a friend named Ellie, and their lives are transformed by that friendship. You can see there's a lot going on in this book. Lots of layers. As Benny and Byron, the two children, are taken on this journey, discovering that their mother is not at all who they thought or assumed that she was, and that just like them, their parents had these multi-layered lives. They had secrets. They faced real adversity and overcame suffering and racism and culture clash. And so the two children have to move quickly past that initial shock and anger that they feel about their mother's deception. And as they keep uncovering these many, many layers of her unbelievable story, they feel ready to make changes in their own lives and to accept that not everyone fits neatly into the narratives that we assign for them. So my customers have loved this book. A lot of them talk about how it kept them up turning pages all night long, even though it's not a typical mystery book. They just wanted to see what was going to happen next in the crazy story of this one unbelievable woman's life. Madyson?
Wonderful. It sounds like a great read.
It is.
So I am going to take on the role of recommending a book for Disorientation. I'm Madyson McGill. My home store is in Los Angeles, and you can follow us at Be Events Grove. So when I was thinking of a book to recommend for Disorientation, I couldn't stop thinking about Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood, which I know is a romance, but like one of the plot lines is that Olive Smith is a PhD student. She is a woman in STEM. And I kind of want to talk more about that plot point because I think it's really reflective of the main character in Disorientation as well. So Olive is a PhD student. She is in a male dominated field. She's trying to get her like research accepted and recognized. And I feel like this book shows like just how difficult that can be for women in particular when they're in a field that is male dominated. Sometimes it's harder to be taken seriously. I know also from like personal experience as someone who was in the journalism field, sometimes it's really, really hard to get recognized. And for Olive, she's done all the research, she's checked all her boxes, and she still runs into like the wall of no one is taking me seriously. She goes to a conference where a guy is like, the only reason we're accepting your research is because like I find you attractive. And you watch her deal with that and how to be like, no, you're going to take my research because this research is sound. I've done all the work. I've checked all the boxes. I've worked hard for this. That's why it's good research. It's not because I'm pretty, you know? So you get to see her like throughout the entire novel kind of have this growth in that and find her stance and find her ground for her to finally like stick up for herself after she's done all this hard work, which is why I think if you focus on that plot point, it's a very empowering novel. Other highlights are if you like the fake dating trope, that is also there because it is also categorized as a romance. So it does have those romance elements. But I think what you also see is that through the romance aspect, you also see her finally like take herself seriously and find someone in her academic adventure also take her seriously. She's worked so hard and she finally found someone who will also recognize that, which is why I wanted to recommend Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood.
Excellent choice. As always, fantastic choices. Thank you both so much. And thank you, listeners, for tuning into Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And also you can follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. Pretty simple. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester out in Cincinnati, Ohio. Thank you both so much, Jamie in Kansas and Madyson in LA. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.